In this video, I'm going to do a quick review of verbs. In each chapter this semester, we're going to do a little bit of work with verb patterns and putting verbs into groups. But this is just meant to sort of jog your memory about what you learned about last year. So remember that the infinitives of verbs, which are the forms that you find in the dictionary, usually end in te mjaki znak. Examples are читать, жить, говорить. Then we have two conjugation patterns. The first conjugation is sometimes called the ye-yo conjugation, and that's because in the pattern you see a ye or yo, and it will always be consistently ye or consistently yo. Here I have a chart set up, and I'll often do this when we see a new verb. Have singular here, plural here, first person, second person, third person. And if we take an example of the first conjugation, we have читать. Я читаю, ты читаешь, он читает, мы читаем, вы читаете, они читают. We can also have a yo verb pattern, like жить. Живу, живешь, живет, живем, живете, живут. Then we have the second conjugation pattern, sometimes called the E conjugation. And if you compare the two, they're very similar. The ya forms are basically the same. We have a choice between u and yu. Most of the rest of the forms are very similar, except for that in this conjugation we have E instead of ye or yo. The only one that's really different is the ani form, where in the first conjugation we have ut yut. In the second, we have at yat. An example of this one is говорить. Я говорю, ты говоришь, она говорит, мы говорим, вы говорите, они говорят. And these two verbs, читать and говорить, very soon we're going to be using them as example verbs for these patterns, and we're going to be putting other verbs into these groups. For the past tense is even easier. All we do usually is take off the infinitive ending, the te mjaki znak, and then add l for masculines, la for feminines, lo for neuters, and li for plurals. Remember that masculine can also be ya or ti, depending on the gender of the person, and feminines can also be ya or ti, depending on the gender. And plural is all plurals, мы, вы, and они. We talked some last year about reflexive verbs. These are verbs that end in ся or с. An example of this is the verb учиться. So note that you can have ся as the ending, that's when the stem ends in a consonant, or с when the stem ends in a vowel. So, as an example, учиться. Я учусь, ты учишься, он учится, мы учимся, вы учитесь, они учатся. Reflexive verbs we're going to be looking at more in depth, but just to remind you, they're sometimes used for reciprocal action, meaning people doing things to each other. For self actions, like doing something to yourself. And they're also sometimes used for passives. Russian verbs have three possible stress patterns. The first one is stem stressed, where the stress is in the middle of the word consistently, like читать. Читать, читаю, читаешь, читает, читаем, читаете, читают. It's always there in the middle of the word. Or we can have end stress, like говорить, also consistent, but on the end. Говорить, говорю, говоришь, говорит, говорим, говорите, говорят. Or we can also have shifting stress, and the stress will always shift in the same way. It'll be on the end for the infinitive and ya forms, like любить, люблю, but then shift forward for the rest of the forms. Любишь, любит, любим, любите, любит. Some verbs have consonant mutations in them. We're going to be looking at this more in depth in the second semester, and I don't expect you to memorize these now. For now, what I just want you to remember is that some verbs have a consonant change in the middle of them. The one we just saw, lubits, is an example. So the b in the ya form changes to bl, like lubit, lublю. Or we can think of an example here. Сказать in the infinitive becomes скажу. So for now, just be aware that verbs have these mutations sometimes. Later, we will get more into depth about this, and I won't expect you right now to remember all these. In Russian, we have only a few verbs that are really, really irregular. Most verbs can fall into these patterns in some way. You know 2 irregular verbs so far. These are хотеть, to want, and есть, to eat. Take a look at them. What's unusual about them? Я хочу, ты хочешь, она хочет, мы хотим, вы хотите, они хотят. Why is this one irregular? If you think about it, it's because here we have what looks like a first conjugation pattern, the ye pattern, whereas here we have what looks like a second conjugation pattern, the e pattern. So this is an irregular verb. But the past tense is completely regular, just like any other verb. Just take off the temyaki znak and add the past tense endings. Есть is another irregular verb. This one is very strange. It has an older pattern that we see in a few verbs. So it goes есть, я ем, ты ешь, он ест, мы едим, вы едите, они едят. In the past tense, we have ел, ела, ели. These are the 2 irregular verbs we know so far. Now I'm going to do a quick review of aspect. Remember, towards the end of last year, you learned about perfective and imperfective verbs. We'll be doing more in depth about this year, but I just want to remind you of some of the main concepts. Here we have imperfective verbs. When are they used? They're used for repeated actions, for when you're talking about the process of something, when you're talking about how long something lasts, the duration, or if you're not talking about any kind of result. Perfective verbs are used for one-time actions, or when you're focusing on the result of something, when an action has been completed, when an action is instantaneous, meaning it happens real quick and then it's over. And sometimes if you're talking about when an action starts, the starting point of an action. In the past tense, you form them the same way. You remove the infinitive ending and then just add your past tense endings. The present tense, we can only have imperfective verbs. Perfective verbs cannot exist in the present tense. So when we have an imperfective verb and we conjugate it, it makes the verb present tense. When we conjugate a perfective verb, however, it makes it future tense. So this can get tricky because when you see a verb conjugated, unless you know whether that verb is imperfective or perfective, you don't know what tense it is. So be aware of that. So when we take a perfective verb and conjugate it, it makes it future. To make an imperfective verb future, we add буду, будешь, будет, будем, будете, or будут, and then plus the infinitive. Let's look at a few examples of these and what their differences are. So for past tense, я читал вчера. Yesterday I was reading. It's a process. There's no focus on finishing anything. It's something that I was maybe doing for a long time yesterday. Versus вчера я прочитал статью. Yesterday, I read the article. I finished reading it, it sounds like. We're focusing on that result of finishing something. With our verb читать, imperfective, obviously we cannot have a perfective verb in present, so we only have something like я сейчас читаю. I'm reading right now. Or we could also have something like Я читаю каждый день. I read every day. Either focusing on repetition or focusing on what you're doing right now. Future tense. Я завтра буду читать весь день. Tomorrow I will be reading all day. Focusing what I will be doing, the process. Versus завтра я прочитаю газету. Tomorrow I'm going to finish reading the newspaper. Sounds like I'm focused on some kind of result. We'll focus more on this gradually during the semester. How do you tell in looking at a verb whether it's perfective or imperfective? That's very tricky. And you can't know for sure which it is. But there are a few rules of thumb. This really only works if you have a pair, however. If you have a pair of verbs that you know go together, sometimes you can make an educated guess as to which one is perfective and which one is imperfective. So we have one set of educated guesses could be if you have a pair like this one, слушать, послушать. No prefix is probably imperfective. Prefix is probably perfective. Again, you can only tell this if you have a pair. If you have a pair like решать, решить, where one is at and one is it, you can take a guess that the imperfective will be the at and the perfective will be the it. Again, this does not mean, though, that every at verb is imperfective and every it verb is perfective. This only works if it's a pair like this. Because if you look at послушать, it's at, but it's perfective. So you have to be careful. This is only if you have a pair. If you have a pair like заказывать, заказать, where one has something in the middle here, we call it an infix. And usually it's an uva or iva infix. Usually that infixed one is imperfective, and the one with no infix is perfective. These are just rules of thumb. They don't always work, and they definitely don't work if you only have one of the pair. But there are some rules of thumb here as for how to guess which verb of the two is which. This is just meant to have been a quick review of some of the things that you learned last year about Russian verbs. We will be going more into depth about these things, but please do let me know if you have questions about what I have laid out here.